The excavation of 3 members of the same family from the village of Moteshun took longer than their killers seem to have taken to dispose of them. The Ukrainians say the victims were tortured before they were killed. This the scene of a possible war crime, now being preserved for evidence. Another body was found near a well on a burnt-out farm. Russia's plan, it seems, is to eliminate dissidents across Ukraine and impose a reign of terror. So say the Americans, who, alongside the British, are leading calls to suspend Moscow from the Human Rights Council of the UN. Satellite images from the town of Bucha show Yablonska Street in the middle here, running up to a roundabout. Look up close and you can see scattered corpses. Crucially, these pictures were taken in mid-March, when the Russians admit their troops were still here. The investigative website Bellingcat says this is drone footage of a Russian armoured vehicle firing on a cyclist as he turns off the same street. And the UN says all the signs are that civilians were deliberately killed.
You could argue there was a military context, for example, to a building being hit. It's hard to see what was the military context of an individual lying in the street with a bullet to the head or having their bodies burned.
At the UN in New York, the Russians repeated their denials and called the Ukrainian government Nazis. But President Zelenskyy, in his first address here, didn't sound like one.
I am addressing you on behalf of the people who honour the memory of the deceased every single day, the memory of civilians who died, who were shot and killed in the back of the head after being tortured. Some were shot in the street, some were thrown into wells, so they died in suffering.
In Spain, there were protests against the Bucha killings, with Spain, Italy and Denmark following France and Germany in expelling Russian diplomats, all accused in so many words of being spies. And more EU sanctions are to come, though the Germans, for all their outrage, haven't yet budged from relying on Russian gas until 2024.
The answer
to these war crimes must be the 5th sanctions package at the European level. And we, as the European Union, must completely phase out fossil energy dependence on Russia, starting with coal, oil and then gas.
The Foreign Secretary in Poland today wants a timetable for the G7, including Germany, to cut off Russian energy, ban Russian ships and exclude more of their banks.
Our coordinated sanctions are pushing the Russian economy back to the Soviet era. But we can and we must do more.
Yet the Ukrainians admit they are struggling militarily in their southeast. With this, apparently the surrender of hundreds of their Marines in the city of Mariupol. So is Vladimir Putin, speaking from his usual distance today, actually cornered and rattled. Not enough, it seems, to sue for peace, with him hinting now at tit-for-tat economic measures against Europe. And the battle for Mariupol may be going Russia's way, as Russian-backed separatists collect the bodies of Ukrainian dead strewn across a landscape of utter devastation. My dad was wounded and my mum was killed, says this woman. How could I leave? I think I'm going to cry. The Ukrainians say the Russians are regrouping not far from here, preparing for another military push. And in a war of countless unfolding horrors, not one of them may have yet changed Vladimir Putin's mind.
Jonathan Rugman there with that report. Well, earlier I spoke to the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and asked him if he believes that Russian soldiers have committed war crimes in Ukraine.
It is increasingly clear that war crimes have been committed because we have seen all the images, we have seen all the reports about war crimes in Bucha and other places, and therefore NATO strongly supports the initiatives to conduct a legal investigation by the International Criminal Court, by the UN. I also welcome the support from the United Kingdom to preserve evidence and to make sure that those who are responsible are held accountable.
But what is NATO going to do to stop the next Bucha from happening, to stop more war crimes being committed right now?
Fundamentally, two things. One, make sure that we are imposing unprecedented costs on President Putin and Russia for this absolutely senseless war he is waging against an independent sovereign nation, Ukraine. And second, by supporting, again at an unprecedented level, the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian armed forces.
Is that enough? Because in the late 90s, NATO got involved in Kosovo because of Serbian war crimes committed there. And Serbia was not a member of NATO, nor of course was Kosovo, which was part of Serbia at the time. This was an out-of-area operation conducted by NATO to stop war crimes from being committed. Why don't we do the same with Ukraine?
NATO has two main responsibilities. One is to provide support to Ukraine. We do that, and we see the effect of that support every day on the battlefield. Anti-tank weapons, air defense systems, shooting down Russian planes and destroying a lot of Russian armor. But we also have another responsibility, and that is to prevent this conflict from escalating beyond Ukraine and becoming a full-fledged European war between NATO and Russia. And therefore we have made it clear that we will not send in NATO troops on the ground because a full-fledged war will cause even more death, more destruction, and be much more dangerous than the conflict we already have in Ukraine.
But aren't we creeping into that position anyway, slowly, piecemeal, by sending more and more robust weapons to the Ukrainians? Because that's the way the Russians are increasingly seeing it, that NATO is getting involved, that it is a war increasingly between NATO and Russia.
Of course, Russia don't like that we support Ukraine, as we have done for many years. But at the same time, our support to Ukraine is support Ukraine's right for self-defense, right, which is enshrined in the UN Charter. And there is a difference between providing support, financial support, humanitarian support, but also then military support with also advanced weapon systems, and to send in NATO troops on the ground in direct confrontation with Russian troops.
But the Ukrainians are saying repeatedly, and actually there are quite a few people increasingly in NATO capitals who agree with them, that if you don't stop the Russians now, if NATO doesn't stop the Russians now, they will just continue. Better to get involved all in right now than to wait for later in the year or perhaps next year.
As I understand that the Ukrainian leadership are asking for more. They are in a desperate situation. At the same time, I'd like to commend them for their courage, pay tribute to the courage of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Ukrainian people, and also, of course, the Ukrainian leadership with President Zelenskyy. But again, to be directly involved is a different thing. It's a very different situation, but even during the Cold War, where you had the Soviet Union and we had the high tensions between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, we were able to prevent escalation of conflict into NATO territory, because deterrence is about making sure that there is no room for miscalculation in Moscow about our willingness to protect and defend all allies. Again, UK is part of that, leading one of the battle groups in Estonia. And as long as we do that together, there will be no attack on any NATO country. We did that. We have done that for more than 70 years, and we will continue to do that in a more dangerous security environment in Europe.
And if NATO were to get involved in one form or another, are you afraid that this could end up being a nuclear conflict?
At least there is a danger for that, because Russia is a nuclear power. Russia has threatened with the use of nuclear weapons, and a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia. It's very hard to predict where that will end, but of course that will be a very dangerous situation for all of us.
Jens Stoltenberg, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Ukraine's defense ministry has warned that Russia is preparing to launch a new assault in the east to try and take the city of Kharkiv. Our chief correspondent Alex Thompson reports now from Chuhuiv in the Kharkiv region. It was one of the first places to be overrun by the Russians until Ukrainian forces managed to recapture it.
Chuhoyiv, the last big town in Ukrainian hands along the road as it goes south here. They've seen bombardments, of course. These craters and wrecked houses were blasted back in early March. But now war has returned. Russian shells pounding this area just yesterday afternoon. 2 more civilians were killed here.
It's very hard, brother. Very hard. Every day, every minute, every second. In the day and in the night, day and night. Every moment, every second, we could be hit.
There was a big explosion. I came out and saw this house was just gone. All our windows were blown out too.
And in the past 24 hours, people here have heard the warnings from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. Everyone has heard the warnings. The situation here couldn't be much more different from that around the capital. Here, the Russians have recently retaken the town of Izium, which is just down the road from this place. We know that Vladimir Putin wants to push out in this area, and what happened here yesterday seems to show they're making good on that pledge. Just a few streets away, a house rendered uninhabitable by a missile which failed to detonate. We met the owner outside. She said since the 1st of April we just can't sleep night and day. It's every hour. She said we've no time to eat because it's so dangerous. Luckily for her, a bomb disposal team pitched up here less than a day after the impact. Took the fuse out, took the hurricane missile out. The road back to Kharkiv, littered with the debris of fighting which has come and, Ukrainians had hoped, gone from here. Now nobody is quite so sure anymore. And at Kharkiv railway station, people from Chuhoyiv are beginning to leave.
I've left the city because it's shelling and bombing all the time there. It's very scary. I have a child. I have a husband, but I left my grandmother there.
At the edge of Kharkiv, we come upon Drobitsky Yar, the Holocaust memorial to 16,000 Jews murdered here by the Nazis. Russia's dictator says this is a war against the Nazis. His artillery shelled the monument to pieces here 10 days ago. Well, so much there for the situation to the southeast of this city, the second city in Ukraine, of course, Kharkiv, where people, as you've just been seeing, have understandable and probably well-grounded fears that the Russians are entrenched and going nowhere fast. Now, a quite different situation obtains to the northwest of this city, if you will, in the region between Kharkiv and the capital, Kyiv. It's here that the Russians have largely redeployed, pulled back or retreated, choose your own verb, in that area. But today, an official at the Russian Ministry of Defense in Moscow accused Ukrainian forces there of what Moscow is calling false flag operations involving the killing of large numbers, hundreds of civilians. Well, you can imagine how that's being interpreted given the recent horrible events that have been discovered northwest of the capital here. Moreover, the regional governor, the Ukrainian regional governor in that area, has himself said that there have been hundreds of civilians killed in that area as Russia pulls back her forces.